Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today and welcome to this Institution of Environmental Sciences webinar, COP26 Reflections from Across the Sector. I'm delighted to be joined by 4 panelists today who will be providing their insights into the outcomes of COP26 from 4 different perspectives of environmental policy, education, marine science, and finance. After their presentations, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions, so please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation. Please make sure if you're asking a question for a particular person that you put their name in the question, and I will then read these questions out on your behalf later on after all of the presentations are done. So thank you so much for logging in, and thank you very much to our panelists as well for joining. Our first panelist today will be Joseph Lewis. Joseph is the policy lead for the Institution of Environmental Sciences, where he is responsible for working to promote the use of the environmental sciences in decision-making and representing the voice of science, scientists, and the natural world. Thank you very much, Joseph. I'll now hand over to you.
Thank you, Ethny. I'm just going to get some slides up on screen, so just hold on for one moment. Right, thank you. So as Ethny says, I'm going to be providing a policy perspective on some of the key takeaways from COP26, going through just some of the highlights for us. So as many of you will know, for more than a year leading up to COP26, the IES used its platform to bring together networks, organizations, and experts from across the sector with the overarching goal of ensuring that the negotiations and all discussions about climate change were properly reflecting the voice of science, scientists in the natural world. So when we're looking back at COP26, for me, there's a degree to which we're asking whether or not that voice of environmental science was represented in the policy outcomes of COP26 and what kinds of action we still require to get us to the solutions which environmental science is telling us we should be taking. So hopefully now the slides will do what we want them to. Amazing. So I want to start by talking about NDCs, because what is there on the table for us to scrutinize? Well, one of the most important things that came out of COP26 and conversations leading up to it were the updates to nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, by the various parties to the convention. These are, effectively speaking, the primary mechanisms of driving change so that we can limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Now, historically, the ratcheting up of ambition under the Paris Agreement was meant to happen every 5 years. And one of the biggest unsung victories of COP26 is that we're now, in theory, looking at updated NDCs every year, which has the potential to make a big difference as long as ambition continues to increase and as long as those NDCs translate into tangible change. In terms of what we've seen already, there's been a very significant push on ambition from countries over the past year, particularly in the weeks leading up to COP26. But despite that ambition, there's a question of where that leaves us in terms of the big picture. Now, if you only look at the 2030 targets, we're at 2.4, but there are also pledges that there which could get us to 2.1, or if you include the targets where they've not yet properly designed a science-led target which will actually result in action, potentially we're looking at 1.8. But to even get to the 2.4, we need to ensure that those commitments are met. We need to inject more science into them, and we need to make sure that those pledges stand up to unexpected, changing circumstances. And then there are also a number of key multilateral agreements at and around COP26. Just going to blast through some of them in terms of highlights. So, for example, we had the pledge to end deforestation by 2030, and we had some finance to support that goal. But that requires that the pledge is kept to and that we see it through to action, starting now. And then you also have something like the methane pledge to cut emissions by 30% by 2030, which could make a significant difference in the short term for slowing warming down, but which requires actual implementation across contexts and which will need to be much more ambitious in future iterations if it's going to have a long-term effect. And then as we get even more intangible than that, we have things like the US and China agreeing to cooperation on climate change. We have wording issues around fossil fuels in the climate pact itself, which signals the need for change, but probably not sufficiently to drive actions where we need them the most. And then we have a shift in narratives about what needs to happen and what is merely desirable that underpins the whole conference. All of these intangible things slowly ticking things forward, but lots of different elements to that. So COP26 saw lots of these big commitments, which potentially will make a massive difference. And the battle now is to ensure that those commitments are met and implemented in a way that aligns with science-based pathways, because if that doesn't happen, none of these things so far will mean anything. And hopefully, as we go on to the next slide, it did it a little bit early, but hopefully we'll do it now. The secret to success will be handling the rocky road ahead, particularly when things go wrong. If something unexpected happens and a country no longer feels that its plans will allow it to reach the targets that it set for itself, the temptation is going to be to keep the plan and lose the target. But if we're going to succeed, a lot of the time we need to be willing to keep the target and change the plans. Our goal needs to be addressing the systems of consumption and production which are embedding unsustainable risks for the future. How we get there can be subject to change, as long as we end up getting there in the end result. So COP26 gave us lots of pledges and strategies which underpin those NDCs, but if we discover that they won't get us to the targets that we set, for whatever reason, we need to be willing to adjust our course to keep that destination in sight, or any of that positive progress is going to be meaningless. But the secret of understanding those risks and how we prepare for them is to make our plans with greater respect to the complex and interconnected natural and social systems which govern the world that we live in, which brings us on to systems thinking. Because fundamentally, we need to recognize that individuals, and that's both people and also companies to some extent, we're trapped within systems. If those systems aren't sustainable, then the individuals lack the ability to change them on their own. So we are psychologically trapped. We see things as cause to effect, when more often than not, we're working with systems which are more complicated than that. It's subtle pressures over time, it's feedback loops, it's holistic, unintuitive change that takes place over the long term. And we need to make sure that these policy goals recognize those psychological tricks that lead us to simplistic solutions some of the time. And we're also socially trapped. We need collective action because we're all contributing to problems and nobody wants to be the first person to change, or it feels like nothing we do will make a positive difference. And this is critical because while adaptation and resilience was taken much more seriously at COP26, that's another little takeaway to look at, it still needs much more to get to where it needs to be. And if nobody feels like they can drive forward transformative mitigation, everyone's paying the price for their adaptation needs during that delay to action. So it's really important we get past these social levers as well. And then also we're procedurally trapped, of course. Often the change we need is above the individual level. We need governments to get involved. We need regulations or incentives to facilitate change. So for me, one of the key takeaways from COP26 was the vast potential for collaboration and co-production across contexts. However, there's still an attitude that the various stakeholders are only responsible for their own silos of emissions or products, rather than anyone taking a leading role to coordinate change that goes beyond those NDCs that properly reflects the complex systems that we're dealing with. We don't yet have that systems approach to the climate crisis and to the ecological emergency and the other interlinking social and environmental challenges that we're facing. And the way we overcome that is through transformative change. Our approach to action cannot be atomistic or incremental. Reducing pressures doesn't end them if they're still embedded in the systems. We need to remove them altogether or decouple them from climate pressures. And addressing one pressure doesn't address them all. We need to deliberately address the system as a whole if we want to see actual change. Most importantly, we need to look at it from the perspective of the systems of consumption and production that underpin those national agreements and the commitments. How do we stop them embedding climate pressures in the long term to make society more sustainable? And the move from the NDCs we have now to this more holistic approach, tying everything together, making the implementation work despite these complex systems, that's the challenge of the next year. That's the takeaway I'm getting from COP on this front. Because it would be insufficient to take an approach that just says, let's keep doing what we're doing, but do a little less of it, or to imagine ourselves as exceptions to the general rule of change. And that applies universally. Nobody can do that. We need to look at the pathways out of the crisis and identify those which will be sustainable for generations to come, and not just environmentally sustainable, but socially and economically sustainable as well. And that requires transformation of these systems as a whole. From the design stage onwards, we should be thinking about how we can create sustainable outcomes. If the response to COP26 showed us anything, it was that people are hungry for change, and for a change that they don't feel empowered to create on their own at the moment. Those people are going to be crucial to co-designing our way out of the crisis, but we also need to look at the core facilitating systems which allow us to drive that positive change. And that's where environmental science fits into the policy question. The challenges ahead are on delivery, implementation, scrutiny, and setting pathways. And those will all be challenges where environmental science is essential to success. We need science to be integrated much better in society, and that's going to mean that environmental science becomes much more active in places it hasn't been before over the next 12 months. To that end, the IES has produced the document that you can see on the screen here, our Manifesto for Transformative Change. So the manifesto brings together the collective expertise of dozens of IES members and stakeholders, including some on the call today, covering the COP26 agenda with a view to the complex systems underpinning the climate discussion and how we can take a systems approach to fighting back. The manifesto sets out 54 recommendations ranging from core systems like energy and transport systems, all the way across to our approach to nature, how we empower citizens and how we embed science in decision making. Now, those recommendations are only meant as a starting point. It wouldn't be possible to create a list of just 50 or so recommendations, which gets us to the future we need, of course. And the solutions we're looking for are going to be subjective in a lot of places. They're going to be different in a lot of places. But COP26 showed us that people are willing to work towards solutions, even where they disagree on the approach to getting there. So yes, in many cases, those approaches will be different in different places, or they'll need to be malleable to account for systemic risks or unintended consequences. And the solution to the climate crisis that we end up with may be very different to the one that we left Glasgow thinking might be a possibility. But after all those caveats and roadblocks, we at the very least can commit ourselves to a systems approach, to the idea of transformative change that goes far enough to actually constitute a solution to these interlinking crises. So have a read of the manifesto and share your thoughts. There's a link in the chat. This is obviously an evolving conversation, and inevitably there will be much more to do as we push for transformative change. However, the manifesto gives us a baseline of what we needed from COP26 and therefore what the summit failed to deliver. In the coming months, we'll be supporting the voice of IES members in scrutinising the implementation of those NDCs and also the Glasgow Climate Pact, as well as pushing for greater ambition that helps us to achieve transformative change. So what's my final takeaway from COP26? Well, the conference has raised ambitions, but those pledges rely on effective implementation and on an ongoing commitment to increasing ambition. We need a big picture view of systems and the potential for unintended consequences, and only then will we deliver on the increasing societal demand for a resolution to the climate crisis. And the voice of environmental science will be crucial to helping us get there. So that's my takeaway. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. That was a really great overview from the environmental policy perspective. And I couldn't agree more with the need for systems thinking and transformative change. And thank you for that strong takeaway with the focus on solutions and implementation, which is going to be so important going forward. So thank you. I'm now really pleased to hand over to our second panelist, Liz Price, Professor of Environmental Education and Deputy Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Sustainability at Manchester Metropolitan University. Liz, thank you so much for joining. Over to you. Sorry, you're on.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'll just unmute. I shared my screen too early. So thank you very much for inviting me. So today I'm going to talk about and give a brief overview of my reflections on what COP26 has achieved and what this means for education, the COP26 theme of youth and public empowerment, and then exploring the UK context and some practical examples with which I'm most familiar. So I hope you can see the slides okay, Ethny. Thank you. So in terms of youth and public empowerment, the presidency programme for COP26 included a Youth and Public Empowerment Day on the 5th of November. And as part of that programme, a Ministers of Education and Environment Summit that was chaired by the UK Secretary of State for Education, the Right Honourable Nadeem Zahawi, and Professor Patrizio Bianchi, Italian Minister of Education, was held in recognition that education is critical to deliver climate action. And that was something that was quite new for this COP26. And as part of this process, the co-chairs welcomed the adoption of the Berlin Declaration on Education for Sustainable Development, as well as the Catania Declaration of G20 Ministers of Education that emphasises the importance of education to address the climate crisis and promote sustainability, and the new COP26 work programme on action for climate empowerment. But crucially, they also recognised the current gaps in providing everyone with the knowledge, skills, values and attitudes needed to effectively participate in the transition towards climate positive societies. And they committed to the integration of sustainability and climate change in formal educations and in professional training. Now, just as an aside, this illustration is courtesy of Hayley, who is our exchange student who represented Climate Action Malaysia at COP26. So we were delighted that she was able to attend. So what is the UK approach to integrating sustainability and climate change in formal education systems and professional training? Well, the UK government has launched a number of reports and strategies to address these gaps. And these include, but this isn't an exhaustive list, the Green Jobs Task Force report to identify the skills needed for a green economy in support of the government's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, the Net Zero Strategy, Build Back Greener, which is a long-term plan for transition, including green skills, and the Sustainability and Climate Change Draft Strategy by the Department for Education across early years, schools, further education, higher education, and children's social care, with a vision that the United Kingdom is the world leading education sector in sustainability and climate change by 2030. Now, the draft is under review until March, and the IES is preparing feedback on the draft, and the final report will be published in April. So do look out for that. And finally, the Lifetime Skills Guarantee and Lifelong Learn Entitlement, supporting people to access training and learning flexibly throughout their lives, that was outlined in the Skills for Jobs, Lifelong Learning for the Opportunity and Growth white paper. So because we have to act today, I thought it might be of interest to explore some practical examples of activities happening now in support of this agenda. And I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to reference some with which I am most familiar and align them to action areas of the Sustainability and Climate Change Draft Strategy. So in particular, I'm going to focus on climate education, green skills and careers, and education and estate operations. Now, the first climate education example I'd like to share is carbon literacy, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which increases citizens' awareness, ability, and importantly, their likelihood to take action on climate change. And in 2020, Manchester Met's carbon literacy programme was shared by the Carbon Literacy Project with all colleges and universities and colleges in the UK as part of their UK government-funded public sector carbon literacy toolkit to maximise the speed and ease with which carbon literacy can be adopted. And during the ESRC Festival of Social Science in November 2021, which was themed to reflect COP26, we shared our training with professionals and volunteers working with young people, such as teachers, college lecturers, youth workers, charities and faith leaders. And with the Carbon Literacy Project, we're keen to share this more widely to support teachers delivering climate change education across the UK. And the second brief example relates to providing opportunities for young people to experience and learn about nature, which is a key feature of this strategy. And the NERC-funded Voices of the Future project will develop new methods of engaging young people in designing, creating and caring for treescapes, which essentially are landscapes where trees play a significant role. And it'll equip them with tools to plan better environments. So fully aligned to the work of the IES. In relation to professional training, Manchester Met's developing and leading a technical skills group for Net Zero Northwest, through which Northwest universities, the FE sector, industry and local government will come together to develop a pipeline of new and transferable skills for a green economy. And through this, we're working in partnership with Net Zero North Skills Alliance to reshape the skills landscape in the region. And it's well recognised that many careers are now accessible through apprenticeships. And the Green Apprenticeship Advisory Panel is identifying existing apprenticeships and creating new ones that best support green career pathways. As one of the biggest providers of degree apprenticeships, Manchester Met has shown that degree apprenticeships can act as a fast-track ladder for social mobility and benefit employers by growing talent and reducing skill shortages. We've also been awarded funding from the Office for Students to deliver short higher education courses through a lifelong loan entitlement, with the aim of providing skills to people in employment without a degree, which may see them facing barriers in their career progression. And finally, focusing on education estate and operations. A sustainable education estate is important because it can normalise and inspire people to live sustainable lives. And as part of Manchester Met's approach to sustainability, we advocate living labs. So sustainability and climate action can be a lived experience for our students through campaigns, projects, initiatives and training, volunteering or relevant paid roles. And examples of this approach from across the sector have been highlighted in the Living Labs issue of the Environmental Scientist, which you can access on the IES website. And just finally, really to circle back to what Joseph was talking about, if you haven't yet done so, I would encourage you to look at the IES Manifesto for Transformative Change, because the section on empowerment makes particular reference to the knowledge and skills communities need to engage with climate action. And we really hope you will get involved in the conversation with IES on that front. So thank you very much for your attention. And just again to add, this is another photo from Hayley, which shows her with a group of women leaders at COP26. So that was all I wanted to say. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Liz. Really great to hear about some practical examples of education and carbon literacy in this space. So thank you very much. And we'll come on to questions at the end for you. Thank you. I'd now like to hand over to our third panelist, who is Professor Ed Hill, CBE, Chief Executive of the National Oceanography Centre. And he's going to be talking about the marine science perspective. Thank you very much, Ed.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to present today. So I just want to open up with a brief remark. Clearly, COP26 has had mixed reviews. On the one hand, some people have described it in harsh terms as a failure, that it didn't secure the NDCs at a level required to keep the Paris 1.5 target alive, that there were clear watering downs of commitments at the last minute to phase out coal burning, still haven't secured the £100 billion a year of climate finance needed to support transition and adaptation in developing countries, and so on and so forth. To the extent that some have even claimed that the entire COP process is not working, that it's incremental, it's fundamentally about kicking the can down the road to the next COP, and is summarized by some as blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, there are more positive interpretations of COP26, not least that it has laid down some very important markers. And indeed, we've heard about this perspective very much from Joseph this morning, and I won't repeat all of the points that he has made. But some of the highlights is that coal clearly is on the agenda now. There have been important commitments on deforestation, progress on a number of the technical issues relating to trans-border emissions trading. And there was also a noticeable emergence of large corporations and private finance starting to mobilize finance and commitments in ways that go beyond what governments themselves are doing, and they were very evident in the process. Also, very noticeably on the agenda, and it was very much a feature of the UK presidency, was nature-based solutions. This is, if you like, the net in the net zero emissions needed to peak and begin to turn the emissions curve by mid-century, and that recognizing that the ability of nature to uptake carbon dioxide, and by enhancing the ability of terrestrial and marine systems such as forests and marine ecosystems to do that, is a way of offsetting, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and to offset the carbon from those sectors that will be particularly difficult to transition by mid-century. Some of the very high energy manufacturing, for example, shipping and aviation, which are particularly difficult nuts to crack. And so nature-based solutions have a role to play in adding to the providing the net in net zero. That, of course, is alongside technological innovations for carbon removal, such as carbon capture and storage, in which we take CO2 and put it back into subsoil, submarine reservoirs. So that was very, very much on the agenda. Within the COP26, the ocean also appeared quite prominently. It would have to be said that the ocean is not yet centre stage in the COP process, and probably is not likely to be. But nevertheless, it was there in a much more prominent way than it has been previously. And in particular, the UK presidency led an Ocean Action Day, which was very much linked and immediately preceded Nature Day at COP26, which focused on the nature-based solutions that I've described. It focused on the ocean climate biodiversity nexus, as it's described, and recognized is that climate change is a major threat to some of the the biodiversity, the key marine ecosystems, which is adding to the other human pressures already on those systems, such as from habitat loss, overexploitation, pollution. But at the same time, there is a prospect by looking at marine ecosystems to achieve the much desired triple win of restoring, enhancing ecosystems, marine ones in particular, in ways that are good for nature because they are able to restore and enhance biodiversity that has previously been degraded. Good for climate, in that many of these ecosystems are also the natural carbon sinks in the environment, and that by restoring and preserving them, we actually are providing those carbon sinks, the net in the net zero. And good for communities because done sustainably, they can enhance the blue ocean economy activities that are underpinned by the services of healthy ecosystems. So the triple win is the promise there. At Ocean Action Day, Secretary John Kerry, who is the US Special Envoy for Climate, spoke very powerfully, in my view. He is a great ocean advocate, but in the context of the US climate position, was very strong in the view that the ocean is not a separate thing to the wider climate program, that there is no solution to climate without the ocean being involved, and that climate action is action to help protect the ocean, because climate is the biggest threat to the marine ecosystems, but ocean actions, action to preserve and enhance marine ecosystems, can also be an important climate action. And there was more than just talk at COP26 on this, and there are a number of specific commitments made. So in addition to those relating to deforestation, there were important commitments around increasing marine protected areas. And in particular, there was a set of announcements by a number of South and Central American states about increasing the scale of their already designated marine protected areas, and indeed joining them up and linking them to be much more integrated systems. Of course, in order to turn these into actions, finance is needed. And at the moment, only 3% of climate finance is related to nature-based solutions. Of course, quite properly, the bulk of climate finance is really targeted, as it should be, on emissions reductions. But nevertheless, given the importance of nature-based solutions, this proportion would need to grow. And of course, only a tiny fraction of that 3% is relating to marine-based nature-based solutions. However, I mentioned before that there was evidence of big private finance starting to become increasingly interested in nature-based solutions, number one, and in the marine ones, the so-called blue carbon sinks in particular. However, I would point out that there are dangers here for the science community, or areas where we need to remain alert, because of course offsetting carbon using nature, and in particular marine-based solutions, is a contentious issue. Yes, it may have a role to play, but of course there are concerns that this, may also be simply a cover for, for greenwashing. And presently, the carbon offsetting market is a completely unregulated market. And as part of their individual organisation commitments, some organisations are seeing carbon offsetting as my view, a ridiculously high proportion of their total contribution to achieving their organisational net zero targets. So it's important to be, alert and aware to this. But of course, it is not merely a question of restoring these natural carbon sinks, and the marine ones in particular, which have been degraded by human activities over many years. But we've now got into a situation where nature itself is now working against us, playing on the opposing team. We've got climate warming feedbacks starting to accelerate the degradation of a number of these important carbon sinks, both the terrestrial ones, but also concerns that some of the very large ocean carbon sinks, such as in the Southern Ocean, are reducing in their efficiency, of which they can sequester carbon dioxide. So a simple process of enhancing carbon sinks and then offsetting that against residual carbon does need to be put in the context that potentially these natural carbon sinks are being degraded by the assistance of climate effects of climate change at a rate faster than we can restore and enhance them. I mentioned that the ocean was not really centre stage at COP26, but of course 2022 sees COP15 of the Convention of Biological Diversity, and here we're expected to see this theme pick up, where we start to see the marine system becoming increasingly prominent in the protection of biodiversity, with the UK, of course, leading an alliance of other countries strongly promoting the target to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030, which is an important ocean action, but done properly is also a climate action. And so we're starting to see perspectives on the ocean changing, from the ocean as a victim of climate change, which it certainly is, marine ecosystems being degraded by climate change on top of the pressures already on them. The ocean is also a threat. Sea level rise represents a major threat to coastal communities and coastal infrastructures and economic activities. But attention is also starting to see the ocean as an important part of being a solution to climate change, and I've described some of those. And indeed, the high-level panel on the sustainable ocean economy, led by at the moment 15 political leaders across the world, very much emphasizes the ocean as a solution, including for contributing to climate, with estimates of up to 20% of emissions reductions needed to achieve the 1.5 degree Paris target, possible through various actions involving the marine environment, whether those be marine nature-based solutions or the use of marine energy, such as offshore renewables, the greening of shipping, and sourcing sustainable food from the marine environment. And so COP26 put down some very important markers, and in particular some markers around the ocean, seeing it as more than a victim or a threat, but being able to contribute towards the solutions. Some of those solutions involve enhancing and restoring marine carbon sinks through protecting marine biodiversity. But marine scientists will need to take very great care in working in this space in order that they're able to contribute towards designing solutions that are viable, have the courage to point out those that are actually unworkable, and to be very careful about not giving credence to those solutions which are either delusional or just downright disreputable. And so as marine scientists get drawn into the center of this debate even more importantly, then it's very important that we do this in a way that we maintain our scientific integrity as we develop solutions at the climate, ocean, biodiversity nexus. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ed. I think that that focus on multifunctional solution for nature, climate and communities, as you put it, is a really strong one. So thank you for that. Everyone, please do put your questions for Ed in the Q&A box. Finally, I'm now pleased to introduce our fourth panelist, Robbie Epsom. He is the EMEA Head of ESG and is responsible for the EMEA implementation of CBRE Global Investors Sustainability Vision. Thanks, Robbie. Over to you.
Hi, everyone, and apologies, I haven't prepared slides, so you're going to have to look at me instead, so apologies for that. But good to meet you all. So I'm the EMEA Head of ESG at CBRE Investment Management. So I'm going to come at this from probably a slightly different angle to the others. So rather than maybe the sort of technical detail, I'm here to probably give you the view of maybe business and so a little bit of a sort of a higher level perspective. And also specifically, obviously coming from the finance sector, hopefully some thoughts on finance and the success at COP26. So I joined CBRE Investment Management at the beginning of 2020, with very much about helping to launch their sustainability vision. That wasn't the reason I was at COP26. So why was I there? I was leading the West London business delegation in the Blue Zone. So I was there for the first week for the World Leaders Summit on the first 2 days, and then for finance and energy. So my perspectives are kind of focused on that first week. I was also the industry lead for them in terms of ESG and finance. So I was there with a West London business hat on, but obviously sustainability is key to us as a business as well, because we launched our vision last year, and climate coming from a real asset company where buildings and even more if you include infrastructure account for around 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So huge business interest to be there as well. Also connected with IES whilst I was up there, which was great. So we managed to link up with the team. And I think one of the key pillars in our sustainability vision is influence. So it's about making sure we're an active participant in the market, and being up at COP, hearing all those insights, being part of the conversation was absolutely fundamental to what we're aiming for. What was my view of COP26? I mean, I guess I should caveat firstly that I'm a bit of a climate optimist, so a bit like Christiana Figueres. I've taken a leaf out of her book, which is, I think we have to be optimistic about this. We have to be positive, particularly those working in the space. And therefore, my view of COP is probably a little bit on the optimistic side compared to others. But I think, maybe if I just put my point across, I can bring you around to that same way of thinking. I think the key thing for me is that despite what the media is saying and maybe some others in the political sphere, COP26, was a positive thing. I think the media and the others need to challenge it. I think that's a good thing, because we can't slow down on climate, can't slow down on anything sustainability related. We've got to keep that pace up. So I think, like in a political opposition, it's good to have those challenges from the worldwide press. And there were shortcomings at COP26, there's no denying that, but we were never going to solve everything at one conference. But what it has done, in my view, is it has moved things forwards, and I'm seeing that on the ground. And we should be very proud. A lot of environmental scientists, engineers, people from STEM backgrounds over the last 2 years have jumped in-house. We've broken down those walls and we've jumped into companies. And so STEM is on the inside now having these conversations. And the reason that's important is because this is the first COP where the real economy actually showed up. So business was there in force, right from the sort of C-suite, so the CEOs, the executive levels, through to people like me and sort of heads of ESG role, internal sustainability leads, but right down to the small businesses, the technology leads, the innovators, and they were all there in the same room in the Blue Zone, but also in the Green Zone, collaborating and talking about how they could solve this. And there was a real sense of positivity and sort of a buzz on the ground, where irrespective of what the outcome was going to be from a political perspective, they knew that they just had to get on with this, and that was really great to see those conversations finally happening. I think on the other end of the spectrum, the thing which I really noticed is that it's the first COP which really started to bridge the gap to everyday people, to the consumers. And the run up to COP26, there was a huge media campaign, things like Sky News, the daily climate show, which is still running every day. They were talking about COP26 on the headlines. It was being analysed in the run up. There were shows, there were all sorts of things. And then during COP26, there was daily stuff. It was on the headlines, in the popular press, in the newspapers, on the TV. And so everyday people suddenly were aware of this kind of previously unheard of conference, maybe other than the outcome of Paris. And that is a really positive thing, because the real change that's going to come out of this is going to be business, the tangibles, the products, the services, but also the consumers and the everyday people. So in my view, it was a positive COP in terms of those things. But I think the key question is was it a success? Because it can be positive, we can have lots of great conversations, businesses can turn up, but it can lead to nothing. I think the first thing there is, we shouldn't forget how much stuff happened before COP26. So COP26 really acted as a target at the end of 2021. And a lot of great stuff happened before we even got to the conference. So you had things like the Science Based Target Initiative accelerated their criteria for net zero, and they launched that in time for COP26. That's key, because that gives us a global definition for net zero, which we are now all getting behind. And lack of consistency, lack of these definitions causes barriers, because there's nervousness around transparency. So we have that, and COP26, in my view, it kind of accelerated that. And we saw the same in our sector in the real asset space. The World Green Building Council again updated their guidance to include embodied carbon, and that again was driven by COP26. But as Joseph said, and others have also alluded to, there was the update of the NDCs. The UK bringing its ambitions up to 78% by 2035, the US doing similar things, targets for the renewable mix in grids for the US, UK, and other Western countries. So it has been really positive in the sense of acting as a target at the end of the year. And in my view, that's why we saw a lot of activity on the net zero agenda in 2021, because it was very much driven by COP26. And I think the latest estimate is we're at 90% of GDP is now covered by net zero commitments. Obviously of varying quality, but that is good, because if they're out there, people have committed, we can start to iteratively improve those. They can be challenged and scrutinized, and things are moving forwards. In terms of finance, what came out of COP26, you will have heard it in the press. There may be some skeptical stuff about it, but I still think it is a positive outcome, and that is GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And that's really important, because that pulled together all the sort of disparate net zero initiatives across the finance sector, from insurance to banking to investment management. And it's pulled it together under one kind of UN race to zero friendly SBTI aligned roof. And that's brilliant. That's where that 130 trillion of private finance is sitting. And that's starting to provide the guide rails for the private sector, in the absence of potentially that sort of policy guide rails, for them to start investing and shifting finance towards that transition to net zero. And that's really positive. And I've already seen the uptick in questions from investors and from optimism and activity in the market space around that. So again, it might not happen overnight, but that has been a significant change. And we just have to look at the number of people that have been brought in-house into finance companies throughout 2020 and 2021 to see that they really are taking this seriously. They're bringing STEM in-house. My new boss, who's our global head of sustainability innovation, is a process chemical engineer just like me, and she sits at Exco level. CBRE Group has put a similar role at Exco level at CBRE Group, again leading on this, and this is fantastic. So we're starting to see that change, and I think one of the key things we've heard from COP26 is that business is going to have to drive this now. I think Joseph mentioned at the beginning, the next countries that are hosting COP aren't going to be quite as ambitious as the UK. So business has a real role to drive this forwards. And I think GFANZ has that opportunity to do that for the finance sector. And cheekily putting out a question, I think from the chat as well, which I think Karen Roberts asked, which is, which sector can do this? I think finance is one of the ones we have to look to. We're already a world leader in finance. Why not be a world leader in net zero and climate resilient finance as well, and also ESG aligned finance? And then just finally, just drawing my thoughts to conclusion, I'll leave time for Q&A, is the Glasgow Pact. Obviously that was one of the key things from a sort of policy and actual formal outcome that came out of COP26. And whilst that wasn't perfect, there were things like the phase out of coal being pulled to phase down, and various other things. What it did do is it put fossil fuels formally in the text, absolutely key. But nearly 200 countries agreed on what needed to be done. And the only thing that really varied in terms of that agreement was the pace at which it needed to be done. But what that did was send a really strong signal to business that this is not going away. All these countries agree on what needs to be done, and the businesses were there in person to hear that message. So that is really powerful. I think that's one of my key takeaways in terms of COP. And what that really does is it starts to provide those guide rails for business on how they take this forwards. And we're seeing that come out in the updated guidance. you know, in the things that are coming out of you know, things like the World Economic Forum, everyone is trying to pull this together so we can move away from that nervousness and sort of start looking at, you know, how we start to, you know, present this data. I think another thing that came out of COP26 on that same point is that just transition, and that really has kind of opened up that subject, and I think that's been driven, in my own personal view, by things like that pushback from phase out to phase down, things like net zero by 2070 for India, where that was, you know, debated and challenged in the sort of popular media. And I think the reason for that is because people are starting to go, why can't every country move at the pace of the developed countries? And A, it shows how important that 100 billion commitment is from developed countries to developing countries, but B, it shows how important the just transition is as a consideration, because countries like India, which have a significant proportion of their grid for things like coal and other fossil fuels, can't just switch it off as quickly as countries in the West can without that support. And so I think the just transition conversation really got kick-started at COP26 in those final days. And I think that's really positive. So final thought from me is just, it was a good COP. The real economy was there. Everyday people started to understand what this is, why this happens. And it's really now on business to take this forwards. And I think 2021, 2022 is providing, off the back of the catalyst that COP26 gave us, it's providing now the means to do that. So I'm positive about the future, but that doesn't mean we can slow down. Thanks, everyone.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Robbie. And I think a really good point about how COP26 acted as a motivator and accelerator for change as well. So thank you to all of our panelists. That was really interesting. If we'd all like to now move into the Q&A session, so please do turn on your cameras. And I know we already have some questions coming through. So to kick off, Joseph, can you give us examples of where siloed thinking or action in one sector by one company has created problems in another? This will help us to understand why a holistic systems approach to moving to a low carbon future is so vital.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think the question is absolutely right, that having those examples really helps. And I suppose the classic example, which isn't really relevant these days, is this sort of prisoner's dilemma scenario where a business would work out, well, if we're the only one who doesn't change our strategy, we might make more profit. But like Robbie says, that's not really, that kind of attitude's going extinct these days. And so it's not really the example we're looking at anymore. It's now a lot more technical in nature, and it's why we need this scientific systems perspective. So I think the other classic example is something like land use, how you're using land, what your approach to land is in general. You need to be thinking about the effects that might have on interconnected systems like air or water. And a lot of people don't have those considerations in the policy they have on land. So in agriculture, until very recently, most countries weren't looking at these spillover effects about runoff from agricultural land and how that affects watercourses, about the ways that agriculture was affecting soil and the consequences of that, the air, etc. So I think that's a classic example. But then perhaps one we're starting to see now, and it links to a question in the chat by Catherine, is about cities and the national level being slightly at odds with one another, because national governments, a lot of the time we're seeing making high level NDC level commitments to change without consideration for what practical implementation will be like in the different contexts within their countries. And the IES is a massive supporter of that scale in terms of driving action. We put out a report last year on just how important cities and the local level are to driving forward climate action. So I think that's a great example of how we can use science to overcome these things. One final very quick example might be, as we pile things, as each sector says, our solution to climate change is some form of electrification, what we aren't answering is questions like systemic risk vulnerability. If everything is electrified, that puts a lot more burden on the electric system. How are we generating that power? Is it clean? Is it going to be universally accessible? And do we have energy resilience that secures it? Because those conversations were going on at COP, but were they happening in the right places to achieve action? Probably not. So that's where we need the additional systems thinking.
Oh, I was muted that time. Sorry about that. Thank you, Joseph. That was yeah, a really important point. So thank you. Liz, I'll move over to a quick question for you, and then I've got another one personally as well. So I think you've linked to it in the chat, but the draft sustainability and climate change strategy, do you know who's being consulted and what the process is to feed into it?
Yeah, so I think from what I know of the DFE, they're very keen to have feedback about the strategy. So I've popped the link in the chat, and there's an email there where you can actually contact them direct to engage in the consultation process and find out more about the engagement. I know, for instance, Teach the Future and Students Organising for Sustainability have already submitted feedback. And as I mentioned before, Joseph is very kindly compiling feedback on behalf of IES and chairs, which is the Education Committee of IES. So I just encourage colleagues who are interested to have a look at the strategy and do contact via that email if you'd like to provide feedback or find out more about the consultation. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Liz. And then another quick question about the practical examples that you talked about in your presentation. I just wondered how youth voices have been included in the delivery of embedding some of those programs, and how that can be done on a wider context for sustainability education.
I think that's incredibly important. So for our carbon literacy, for instance, our majority of our trainers are students. So we have a train-the-trainer model. So our students become carbon literacy trained, then they become trainers. And so the youth voice is embedded throughout our carbon literacy training. And that's very empowering for them in terms of their employability skills as well. In terms of the Voices for the Future, of course, young people are absolutely instrumental in that as well. And certainly the work that we do at our university, and I know at lots of other universities, the student voice really drives all of those activities. In terms of the professional skills linked to employers, there's perhaps less of a young youth voice in that, but certainly we engage with employers and all of the stakeholders, because as we've talked about before, and Joseph has talked about, working in partnership for shared solutions is the only way we're going to do this. And also the point that was made about cities. I mean, I think in Manchester, we have a tendency to just get on with it anyway, and then highlight where we need support for government to do that. And so far, that strategy seems to be fairly successful. So we work very closely with the city. We work very closely with Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which is it's a much larger entity. And we sort of align to government and international strategy, but really try and get on with it anyway, but then look for support, because unless there is government support and drivers and signals for particularly industry is not going to invest unless they've got some green lights that actually they're not barking up the wrong tree. So I think it's not just about engaging youth. Youth is very, very important. It's about engaging everybody, I think, is crucial. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you, Liz. I think that's really important, engaging with all stakeholders. Thank you. Ed, moving over to you. We have a target to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. Is there a similar target for global sea temperature? Will increasing the ocean's capacity to absorb carbon by promoting biodiversity increase sea temperatures?
Fine, thank you, Ethny. So there is no specific target relating to ocean temperatures. It's the global surface temperature is 1.5 degrees, which includes both the land and the ocean. So it's part of the 1.5 target. And sea temperatures, sea surface temperatures, surface temperature, and atmospheric temperatures are very closely coupled, because the two interact very, very strongly. So the straight answer to that is there are no specific targets relating to sea temperatures. Of course, the ocean is three-dimensional space. So the heat is actually being penetrating below the sea surface, and in fact, 93% of all excess heat is being absorbed in the ocean, 2/3 of which is in the upper 700 meters. So it's that is what is going on. In terms of nature-based solutions and interactions with surface temperatures, I don't think we know the answers to that, except at high level. Taking CO2 out of the atmosphere is the thing one needs to do to stabilize global surface temperatures fundamentally, and to the extent that restoring marine ecosystems can contribute to that, then the broad thrust of it is that it will be contributing to reducing overall global surface temperature.
Thank you, Ed. That's great. Thanks. Robbie, there's a question in the Q&A box about the use of GDP as a measure for success. And I wondered if you wanted to comment on that. Just an extra thing from me, thinking about, as you mentioned, businesses did play a prominent position in this COP26. And I just want to know, what support do you think that businesses need from the government in order to push through some of these net zero ambitions?
Maybe starting with the first one, I think in terms of support, I think one of the biggest barriers for businesses is kind of lack of comparability and consistency, particularly when you get into places like the finance sector, because what you don't want is 3 different financial organizations putting out their data and their progress, but using completely different technical assumptions, because then to their investors, one could look worse than the other simply because they're doing the right thing, as opposed to the other not doing the right thing in terms of including all scopes for greenhouse gas accounting. So I think having that sort of steer is key, but that doesn't necessarily have to come from government. You know, the Science Based Targets Initiative are doing a very good job of providing that kind of global framework for net zero in terms of definitions, particularly around things like offsetting, moving to neutralization and kind of compensation sort of language. So I don't think it all has to come from government. Where government is really effective is when they create a kind of date in the future that business starts working towards. And a great example of that is the date for diesel and petrol cars effectively being turned off in terms of new sales. And you can just see the impact that's already had on the EV market, both in terms of EV infrastructure, electric vehicle, and EV as an actual product, that's now suddenly been made by most car manufacturing companies. So that sort of thing in the future gives business a very good mandate to just get on with the change. So I think those things work really well. But in the meantime, they do need guidance. And at the moment, we're moving beyond greenhouse gas accounting to all ESG. And that's a very vast, complex subject, particularly when you go onto the social side, because how do you quantify things which are largely qualitative and quite subjective in nature, particularly as you move from country to country. So I think that's the kind of key thing on the business side. But I think business has a huge opportunity to lead. The things which we buy as consumers are businesses. The services we use is business. The roads, all these things that even the government will pay for are still built by businesses in terms of the infrastructure. So I think business has a huge role to play here. And I think that's why it was nice to see that COP26 has caught up. In terms of GDP, I don't get too hung up in all these things. I'll use what I can as a scientist and engineer to try and get my point across. If I can say that using GDP as a metric, over 90% of the world is now covered by net zero commitments, that's a strong message. And I'll caveat it with of varying levels of quality, but that does help when it comes to pushing the fold. And I think as scientists and engineers and people from a STEM background, we all have responsibility to use what we can to push this agenda forwards. It doesn't matter necessarily how we measure this. What matters is the change and the impact. But we are going to have to get to a point where we can, at least within our own organizations, make sure we're getting that impact in terms of progress. So it is going to be useful to have common frameworks, but what we use to communicate it in terms of GDP, I'm not too precious about.
Thank you, Robbie. Really interesting answer. Thank you. So I'm afraid that we don't have time to go through all of your great questions today. Thank you so much for putting them in. I will just mention one thing quickly from personally at COP that I saw. So there's a question from Noel about the kind of dealing with problems in an integrated way, and you use the example of air quality. I did actually attend an event which was looking at Ether is producing some guidance on integrating air quality emissions measurements and climate pollutant measurements. We actually, the IQM, our sister organization, has a webinar on this on the 8th of February. So I would recommend you go and watch that one. I do think people are starting to talk about how you can kind of think about these issues in an integrated way and develop solutions that work for more than one problem. I'm now just really quickly to end, I'm going to put all of the panelists on the spot a little bit, I apologize in advance. And just to give a really quick one-sentence answer to what would you like to see at COP27? What one thing? And Robbie, can I start with you?
Can I do it by answering the final question there? Because I think that is a good final point, and it applies to COP27. Is I think as a community in the STEM sector, environmental science, we have got to move away from thinking that by solving the problems of the planet, it means that we make a loss financially or that it's not good for business. They're not kind of, they can be, you can do both. You can do the right thing, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and make a profit and have a successful business, SME or large corporate. And we have got to champion that. It's complicated and it's tough, but we have the means to solve that. And that's the challenge we've got as we're on to COP27. We have to make this a positive thing that people and businesses want to do. So that's my call to action.
Thank you, Robbie. Joseph?
My thought for COP27, let's get interdisciplinary. So not just in the conversations at COP27, but in every project leading up to it, when there's something else adjacent to it that we don't have expertise in, who can we talk to about that? What multiple benefits can they tell us about? What systemic risks can they warn us about? That's the way that we're going to make COP27 a massive success for systems thinking, is if we start these massive interdisciplinary conversations, learn from each other, think more, talk more, learn more. That's what I think.
Thank you, Joseph. Ed?
Yes, I'd like to see continuing and growing emphasis on the connection between the issues of biodiversity and climate. These are not separate issues. They are totally entwined, and that the solutions can go across the two and need to go across both of them, and which emphasises whole systems thinking and multidisciplinarity, which has been said by everyone.
Thank you. And Liz?
Well, in addition to all those ones have already gone, I would like to see continued focus on education as a mechanism for behaviour change for everybody, but also for skills development to equip everybody with the skills they need to deliver more sustainable futures for us all.
Wow, thank you. Really strong points from everyone. And thank you so much for all our panelists. It's been a really interesting conversation, and one which is interdisciplinary. So that's really good to see and to start having these conversations more. So thank you so much for all of your perspectives. And thank you to all of the attendees as well. It's great to see so many people here. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the IES YouTube channel. Our next webinar is on the 3rd of February, and this is on restoration handbooks for restoring blue carbon. So please do register for this on our website if you can. And just, a massive thank you to everyone, and I hope to continue these conversations moving forward. Thank you very much.